Hello, dear friends and listeners. It has been a long time since I have joined you in this podcast. In fact, I think the last time was in October of last year, 2024, and a lot has happened since then. Immediately after, pretty close after I did my last podcast around that time, I contracted COVID, and so I was out for a week due to that. I also became heavily involved in the campaign to defeat Donald Trump, which sent me to Washington, D.C. and North Carolina, among other places, to try to make a difference in the campaign. Unfortunately, I was obviously unsuccessful. And after Election Day, I just did not have any motivation to immediately podcast again. Like many in the country, I was in a period of depression and very mournful and fearful of what another Trump administration would bring. And ultimately, I just needed a respite from the entire election season and the insanity of the campaign we had all witnessed. So I took some time off with Europe for the Christmas markets, and now several months have gone by. I actually had prepared multiple stories about threats to Western democracy in places like France and in Germany, threats to the constitutional order around the globe that I wanted to talk about, what was latest developments in Ukraine. It's been difficult because every time I was ready to discuss those, I had to toss those stories aside because there was new and impending danger on the horizon from what we were learning about the Trump administration. And then Inauguration Day rolls around, very dark and bleak. And obviously, we've all witnessed what has occurred just within the last 12, 13 days. I mean, the first 12 and the 13 days of the new administration, and it has felt like an entire year. There's an old meme that goes around annually about January and how it's nice that January is over now, the year of January. And I think truly for those of us who are politically mindful and care about the state of um, the world and the United States and its leadership, or lack thereof now, January truly felt like a year, particularly the last 2 weeks. So there's a lot to digest, and I feel like I've been putting off this podcast because of that, because every time I have stories in hand, there's new stories, and it's more grim and it's more dire. So I needed to get this off the ground because number one, I want to return to a weekly podcast format, and in some cases, record a couple times a week if the news warrants it. And right now, there's a lot of news. There's a lot to cover, and I think at least for the first month, maybe a couple of months, I may be heavily focused on the United States. That isn't to say I'm not going to cover, obviously, pending events in other states around the globe. I definitely will, and I will definitely cover those developments, particularly as they relate to the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, the conflicts in other regions and in other countries, and political developments in other countries, threats to the established order. So, this podcast was envisioned as a foreign affairs, international relations, international events podcast, and it will be. But unmistakably, the new administration and what they are trying to do, not only on a foreign policy scale, but on domestic level, poses a threat to the international order and has an intense and significant ramifications for the rest of the world, particularly our allies. So I can't ignore that. And in fact, I have to draw attention to it because it's significant enough to where it needs to be front and center, at least for the first 60 to 90 days. So the news of what's happening with the Trump administration, their policy rollouts or their mangled rollouts, their cabinet appointments and confirmations, all of that will be prime discussion with ancillary discussions about other news as it occurs around the world. And in some of those cases, it'll be countries reacting or retaliating in certain ways against the United States. But I will also focus on um, absurd but yet dangerous developments as it relates to the United States and its policy positions with other countries, such as Trump's insane rant and obsession with taking back the Panama Canal, his obsession with taking Greenland, and the foreign policy crisis that Denmark has been plunged into. So those will be front and center just because other nations are directly impacted. Also, topics like the impending tariffs and how that's going to impact our relations with Canada and Mexico, and how a trade war results in nobody winning. It seems like we have forgotten basic economics. So there's a lot to cover. I'm glad to be back with all of you. I'm glad to be in a state of mind where I am much more willing and able to talk about these issues. And I do want to step back though and highlight a couple of things. First and foremost, over the next several months, you will hear the Trump administration and its defenders, minions within the media and from the bully pulpit claim that the Trump administration has a mandate for these policies based on the election outcome. But let's get one thing very, very clear. Trump won with a plurality of the vote. He did not win a majority. In fact, he did not even win 50%. He won 49.9% of the popular vote. It's the lowest showing for a winning incumbent, because I think you can call Trump an incumbent since he has served before, in more than a century. And it is one of the lowest performances of any winning presidential candidate, incumbent or non incumbent, when there was not a strong third party challenger like Ross Perot in 1992 and 1996 within the last 50 years. So 49.9% is not a mandate. In fact, what is true is that more than 50% of the country voted against Donald Trump and voted for somebody else. And also, let's also be clear that Donald Trump won this election because turnout was lower in 2024 than it was in 2020. Somewhere around 7 million voters stayed home. And that is most obvious by the fact that Trump only won with 77 million total votes. Biden won in 2020 with 81 million. So that's about a 4 million difference, part of that 7 million drop in turnout. And so that is also significant because Biden still holds the distinction of having won with the most popular votes of any president in history. Trump not only did not exceed that number, he never reached it. So that is something I think that Democrats and everybody in the anti-Trump coalition will have to ask themselves in the coming months and years. They analyze and pour over the election results, why there were millions of voters who were motivated to turn out in 2020, but not motivated this year. Also, we're going to have to confront voter suppression efforts and the legitimate impact that those measures had in reducing turnout in some cases where ballots were thrown out, in cases like Texas and in Georgia, where purges of the voting rolls resulted in legitimate American citizens not being able to vote. And if they were able to vote, it was last minute where they had to be prepared to vote via a in-person paper ballot and provide additional information for their vote to count, not knowing for certain if it was going to count. So undoubtedly, many measures like that were passed in red states as part of the election denialism after 2020 and the big lie had an impact not only on deterring voters but actively suppressing voters. The fact remains that Trump did win. He did win more of the votes than Kamala Harris, although he won less with less votes than Biden did because of reduced turnout overall this year. Not as many people were Americans were motivated to turn out to vote. And he also won all of the swing states that were up for grabs. But again, Trump won literally based on somewhere between 150 to 2 because of 150 to 200,000 voters in about 7 swing states. There were enough voters there that could have turned the election the other way. Now, all that said, uh, I reinforce that because that is not a mandate. Uh, Winning by a couple of percentage points isn't a mandate. If you win by 50, 52, 53, heck, Biden won more votes than any president in history, and he won 51% of the vote, and Republicans still claimed he didn't have a mandate and fought him every step of the way. So Trump does not have a mandate with under 50%. Trump was a default de facto choice among many who were not crazy about either candidate, and we're not going to argue that. But I think that what we are seeing now with the Trump administration moving aggressively and making sweeping changes in line with the Project 2025 policy agenda, that is not what most Americans voted for, obviously, and particularly the more than 50% of Americans that cast a vote for somebody other than Donald Trump, but also many in his own coalition who voted for him reluctantly and did not want to see him make these kind of moves. So we'll get to that later. I think we have to before I talk about what we've seen roll out over the last week and a half, because there's a lot to unpack there, a lot to digest, and a lot of it is very discouraging. American democracy in many ways is on life support right now. Our only recourse is really the courts, particularly because the legislative branch has allowed itself to become a instrument of the executive branch and essentially an extension of it, and does not seem to be showcasing any authority. We know it was not going to exert an ounce of independence under Mike Johnson, who is really just Trump's deputy. But it's also fairly discouraging that the existing, the new Senate Majority Leader has also uh, is starting to show signs that he's following in his footsteps. Now, I don't want to react too soon because it is early and people can change, political calculus can change. John Thune was a deputy of Mitch McConnell, so he was thought he was the more establishment choice who won the leadership election, and it's still possible he could return to his more traditional Republican establishment bona fides. But he so far is not choosing to do that. And to actually win his leadership election, he really had to play to Trump. So, one of the most jarring and extremely upsetting incidents that occurred immediately on Inauguration Day was the full and unconditional pardon that Trump made, the sweeping pardon of all of the January 6th insurrectionists. So all of those who were in jail were immediately pardoned, and those whose cases were still being adjudicated were pardoned. Many of these criminals had viciously and violently attacked police officers on January 6th, 2021, beating them with U.S. flagpoles, tasing them, punching them in the face. This isn't uh, subject to speculation. We have the videos. Many of these people filmed themselves engaging in this vile conduct. In other cases, they were recorded by others. This was streamed online in social media in real time. The videos live on. And so this isn't something that requires one to engage in um, any type of speculation at all. We witnessed it. And virtually in every case, judges have convicted and sentenced these criminals. We did have Officer Sicknick who died during January 6th, uh, and others who we had more than 150 who were injured as well. So, there's no doubt as far as what actually happened and uh, who was involved on that fateful day. And you have um, officers like Officer Gonell, who were, receiving messages and violent threats, and also notifications on the day that Trump made these pardons that all of these people who he had testified against were now going to be released. He even called it a miscarriage of justice and a betrayal, a mockery, a desecration of the men and women who risked their lives for democracy. And it's staggering when you think 150 police officers were injured. As many times as Republicans want to deflect and talk about the riots in the summer of 2020, post George Floyd, which did cause damage, but there were not 150 police officers ever injured in a single event, a single riot event during those riots, like happened on January 6th. And all of the instigators and uh, troublemakers during those riots were charged and were prosecuted, charged, and faced convictions. They faced justice, and they weren't pardoned. And I think that's what is so sickening about this is that Trump didn't differentiate between even violent and offenders and those that just kind of followed the crowd and rushed into the Capitol. He, with one fell swoop, pardoned everybody, and it's sickening and sad to see. Uh, and like I said, officers like Harry Dunn have already spoken out about this, uh, and others will. But I think what's also different about this as a blanket pardon is that usually pardons are given to defendants who are in jail, who have served a certain amount of their sentence already. Trump has shown time and time again that he will pardon defendants even before they've been sentenced, before they have served out their any of their sentences in some cases, let alone a majority of their sentence. That is a departure from norms, and a pretty clear departure. Now we've seen that, a handful of times and throughout history in some other cases. Obviously, the most notable and notorious example was President Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon to prevent him from actually being Nixon from being prosecuted for Watergate, which was very controversial at the time. But even that doesn't compare to the violent assault that we saw on January 6th. And it's also notable that several of these defendants have already primed again, shocker, right? And have been arrested. One of them was rearrested for sexual assault against a minor. Another one was in a standoff with a police officer, attacked a police officer again, and was shot and killed. Another one has allegedly committed vehicular homicide and has been rearrested. So, it's a very dark way to look at it, but a lot of these offenders will likely be rearrested at least and charged and convicted of other crimes because that's the nature of someone who commits an act that's this violent and who shows no remorse and shows this level of defiance. There is going to be other crimes committed. And so, but not only has this been a miscarriage of justice, it shows that the system did not work. The system to contain Donald Trump. Obviously, the U.S. Senate had a chance to impeach Donald Trump, which would have forbidden him from running for any federal office again in the future. It would have saved us from a Trump presidency. They didn't do that. Mitch McConnell and other Republicans told us that Trump would be tried by the courts. The courts would take care of him. That was the place, voters in the courts rather than the Senate. They abdicated their duty. And then we found out, guess what? The courts made up law out of wholesale cloth and decided that the president is essentially immune from prosecution. that's considered his quote unquote official capacity. And they created this whole new rubric for defining official versus unofficial acts, except they didn't define it. It's so ambiguous, they left it to Jack Smith and others to define. So they basically absolved Trump of that. And then you had Judge Eileen Cannon, who had virtually no trial experience, appointed to Trump after he lost his first election in the waning days of his presidency in December, um, confirmed by the Senate, who has time and time again been a get out of jail free card for Trump, and who decided that basically special counsels were unconstitutional, which isn't true, which would have invalidated well over 50 years now that we've relied on special counsels, and who basically dismissed the case against Trump, the Mar-a-Lago documents case. So, and now we have Trump himself, who essentially was going to fire Jack Smith, and Jack Smith resigned as special counsel because Trump is president again and now can't be indicted. So the system did not work. The judges did not work. The voters did not work. The Senate had an opportunity to show not only courage, but to show respect for the Constitution, for our system of government, provide that check in our system of checks and balances, and they did not. Our system did not hold, and we are in a situation where a convicted felon who led and propagated an insurrection against his own government, our government, who tried to stage a coup and prevent his opponent from taking office, has now been elected, who tried to overturn the election through a false elector scheme by uh, pushing state legislatures to appoint fake and false set of electors on his behalf, pressuring secretaries of state like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia to quote unquote find votes where they didn't exist, who even contemplated using the levers of his own Department of Justice to seize voting machines and declare martial law. Like there is no doubt that Trump attempted to engage in unconstitutional tactics and dictatorial tactics to remain in office, and has continued to propagate the lie that he won the election when he clearly did not, and that it was fraudulent and rigged. And even if the insurrection had not happened, his attempt to remain in power through false electors to circumvent democracy, as it's spelled out in the Constitution, would have been enough to impeach him. And then you put the insurrection on top of that and the loss of life and the actual attempt to pressure Vice President Mike Pence into not um, doing the formality of certifying the election. That is just basically gravy on top of an otherwise, disgusting heap of mashed potatoes, essentially. I mean, you have so much evidence in this case. But the Senate did not act, so we are where we are. And the reason I bring all this up is that Trump is more emboldened than ever, and he is on this revenge tour to cast out anybody from government that attempted to hold him accountable, particularly from the FBI and DOJ. And it didn't have to be this way, but I think it's also very tragic and very embarrassing that largest the what was supposed to be and what has been up until this point the world's strongest and oldest and most robust democracy, the United States, has failed to live up to the example it has set for other nations. But we did see a case recently where another country had a threat to their democracy from their own chief executive, and they stood strong. They took appropriate action, and they held that president accountable, and that is the country of South Korea. So I want to just zero in on South Korea at the moment as a case study in what can happen correctly and what can happen right. So this past year, um, I think it was really interesting. The South Korean president um, declared martial law, and it was a just shock to South Korea's democracy. And keep in mind that South Korea is a stable, uh, very economically strong democracy, very much influenced by the United States post Korean War and the breakup of the Korean Peninsula between Communist North and the Free South. But South Korea has not been a democracy for very long. And they've gone through some turbulent times. In fact, I think if you go back to the 1980s, let's see here. So yes, so it was 1987. There was a incident, the June Democratic Struggle of 1987, which ended authoritarian rule, creating the Sixth Republic in South Korea. Of course, South Korea is now considered one of the most advanced democracies in the continent. So only as recently as 1987 has South Korea had a pretty robust democracy. But yet, they recognize the threat from their existing president declaring martial law and what that would mean. And so you had a period of 6 hours. It only took 6 hours for the South Korean people and for elected representatives to react. And the declaration of martial law was part of the paranoia of uh, basically President Yoon and calling his opponents communist forces. Who does that sound like? But immediately people started protesting the streets within hours. And of course, his declaration of martial law not only stunned the South Koreans, it stunned us. We have a defense pact with South Korea that goes back several decades, and it put that in jeopardy. It would threaten to destabilize the entire Korean peninsula. And of course, the North Koreans are more than happy to take advantage of any unrest in South Korea. But declaring martial law is considered a nuclear option. So it's essentially where if a president declares martial law, he uses the military to seize control of not only the government, but of the country. And as soon as he declared martial law, soldiers attempted to enter South Korea's National Assembly building, which is their equivalent of our Congress, our Capitol building, on December 4, 2024. And y- there was a reaction immediately. So when this happened, um, both main political parties in South Korea, even the president's own party, condemned him. They came together to say that we're not going to stand for this, and that this action is not only wrong, it's illegal. This is a president too who has faced years of fraud accusations, scandal accusations in terms of illegal fundraising, and he, had remained relatively robust within his own party, robust groundswell of support until this existential crisis, essentially. Within 6 hours, the National Assembly there in South Korea took action. They rebuffed his attempt to take power. There were mass protests throughout the night in South Korea. The National Assembly immediately came together to hold a vote of impeachment, which they did. And the president was forced to reverse the martial law vote hours later, um, and and calls for his resignation began immediately. And the vote for martial or to impeach the president wasn't even close. He has been impeached now, And so his second in command is in charge in South Korea. And it's interesting too because um, the courts have also acted swiftly. So not only did South Korea's political establishment come together, both parties, to say, we are going to stand for the rule of law and we're going to stand for our democracy, against this illegal action. And but it's not enough that he has reversed course. Like this can't be allowed to stand. So the impeachment vote was lopsided. It was something like 400 to 20, something like that. But also the courts have stood up, and a South Korean court just um, earlier this month in January approved an arrest warrant against the sitting president, and it's the first time that a sitting South Korean president has ever had an arrest warrant. And so it's another instance of the showdown. There's an active investigation. He's been stripped of all his presidential powers already. The impeachment vote took place earlier in January. And I should say that initially, when the National Assembly was going to vote to impeach him, they did stand down when he reversed his call or reversed the martial law order, but because he refused to resign after that, and they had voted on a resolution to demanding he resign, that's when impeachment started. And he's being investigated by South Korea's anti-corruption agency on charges of abuse of authority, orchestrating a rebellion. The sitting president, no longer the acting president, but he was the sitting president. He now has a detention order issued because he refused to answer summons from investigators in recent weeks. Like he's not cooperating, and so he's under detention. And so he can now be held for up to 48 hours for questioning by police if they'd like. And again, like these are things in the United States we can't envision happening against a US president because uh, there has been this fear of taking action against Trump. And also, the courts have now, created a whole new methodology for presidents and how they should be treated differently for alleged crimes. But that's not the case in South Korea, where equality under the law actually, it's not a central tenet technically of their court system, but it's occurring in real time and it's working. The idea of democratic government and representation of the people is working over there, where it's not here. And I just want to draw attention to that because it's refreshing, because it only took 6 hours for South Korea's representatives to rise up, take action, get the president to back down, basically give him an ultimatum that he needed to resign. And when he didn't resign, they impeached him. And he was forced out by that impeachment. And then he is still going to be charged and face criminal charges for his conduct and actions. And the courts are holding him accountable, and their national anti corruption agency is holding him accountable. So accountability is coming from multiple places within South Korea's political and judicial system. And the United States, we can't get accountability from the voters. We can't get it from our elected representatives. We can't get it from the court system when it comes to Trump. And instead, Trump was rewarded for another term. But it is refreshing to see that threats to democracy are taken seriously, and leaders who commit those who attempt to overturn democracy or to seize unauthorized power are held accountable in some countries, like South Korea. So, South Korea, I think, is a case study for how it's done right. It should be a guide for us in the future. And, you know, we are a case study basically for the rest of the world and what not to do. And so I think, if anything, I think we have a lot to learn. And, I think the one I think odd and frustrating critique you hear from people who were squeamish about Donald Trump being convicted, or charged, I should say, facing trial and conviction and possible sentence in the course of a election campaign, is what that would mean, for norms, having a former president put in jail. Most democracies around the world have not hesitated when former presidents have committed crimes to hold them accountable like you do, uh, a civilian in the civilian population. In fact, that's the test of I think, a strong, true democracy is the willingness to hold everybody to the same standards and hold everybody equal under the law. And the fact that we refuse to do that, and we seem to be flirting with this idea of an autocratic executive, someone with powers akin to a king or a monarch, it's not only antithetical to everything the founders envisioned, but it's deeply against what should be ingrained in our DNA, or what used to be, I should say. I feel like, as a citizen body, we have changed over the last couple of decades dramatically from, the hundreds of years of our history. If you go back and pore over the individual writings of the framers who signed the Declaration of Independence and then who later worked on the Constitution, there was great fear and back and forth tension on just how detailed to be within the Constitution and spelling out the presidential powers, and where to put down limits. Because there was great fear that a out of control president would uh, rule like a king. And you have to remember that the British colonists, all they had known was monarch, and a semi-absolute monarch, and King George II and then King George III. So that was what they knew, and that's what they wanted to avoid. And they thought they had crafted this balanced system, which is brilliant and continues to be a brilliant beacon for the rest of the world, and not only balance of powers, separation of powers, co-equal branches, checks and balances between three branches. It's brilliant on paper. Yet, and the impeachment process is there, high crimes and misdemeanors, and so it's broad enough to include many classifications. It's not too specific to where a potential president could really get away with power, but it still relies on people doing the right thing, which has not been borne out in our system. But nowhere within the Constitution does it say a president or former president cannot be charged or held accountable for criminal conduct, for actually violating the law, which is what the Supreme Court has said now. But we do know that people from Jefferson to Madison to even Hamilton, they were on different sides of the political spectrum in terms of how large they thought the government should be, and whether we should be a confederation versus a federal republic, whether we should have a national bank, as Hamilton promoted, versus having, more decentralized economic authority. But they all agreed that the president needed to be constrained under the law by a citizen legislature in the form of Congress, with two bodies, a House and a Senate, and there needed to be recourse to hold the president accountable. That's not happening. South Korea showed us the way. They've held their president accountable. I will continue to follow the anti-corruption investigation, the criminal investigation. He is already out of power and been impeached. But again, it's amazing that within 5 hours and then within less than 2 months, they held their leader accountable for, overturning the tenets of democracy and trying to declare martial law and using the military to beat down the door of their National Assembly. We have not. We have not. Um, so, in that same vein, I do want to also draw attention to the fact that The reason this matters is that the Trump is not chastened or humbled or uh, embarrassed by any of the cases that were proceeding against him. The fact that all of them have essentially just fallen away because he is now the president has just made him more bold to go after his enemies, which he is doing at breakneck speed. I mean, this last Friday, purging the DOJ of all of its career civil servants, whether that would be, the from those that are high on the totem pole, all the way down to junior level deputies, anybody that was involved in any of the cases against him, anybody that was involved on the Hunter Biden case, he wants out. Because essentially what he sees the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation as extensions of himself and his power. And some Republicans are arguing that they are essentially, and that he has the ability to do this. I mean, it's another reason too, um, so that his demand that the well, I should say it's a demand. Um, his promise that he was going to fire the director of the FBI as soon as he took office. That was also a departure from norms. So let's be clear about one thing. Um, FBI directors serve 10-year terms, and typically their terms basically carry over from one administration to the next. All of our FBI directors have been Republicans as far as their affiliation. Many of them, all of them have been appointed by Republican presidents. And in fact, Democrats who have come into office have typically always continued using the services of the FBI um, uh, directors that are in office. Um, so it's really unprecedented for a president to fire an FBI director. Can he? Yes, he can. Trump did, and Trump fired James Comey, which was actually fairly unprecedented back during his first term, because Comey would not, do what Trump wanted in terms of doing illegal things. The FBI is supposed to be semi-independent, quasi-independent. Yes, they are appointed by the president initially and confirmed by the Congress, by the Senate, but they work for the American people. The cases that they pursue are on behalf of the American people, not the president. They are not the president's police force. They are not in direct service of the president's agenda or policy goals. And and the line that we are hearing repeatedly from the mouthpieces of the President Trump's defenders and people who work for him in the administration are so and so is being fired or released because they will not serve to advance President Trump's policy goals and President Trump's agenda. That was the reason given for the purging of the FBI and DOJ, because it is believed that these agents will not serve and defend President Trump's agenda. The FBI and is not there. The Department of Justice prosecutors are not there to serve the president's agenda. They are there to prosecute cases on behalf of the American people, period. That is what they are there to do. And the fact that their entire rationale for existence is being rewritten right before our eyes should alarm everybody. But Christopher Wray was the prior FBI director who actually had taken over after um, I don't know, let's if for those who can't remember the history during Trump's term, like get ready for Trump on steroids for term two. But essentially, James Comey is fired for not doing Trump's bidding. Andrew McCabe becomes acting FBI director before he is let go by Trump for insufficient loyalty. And then Christopher Wray then becomes FBI director, acting FBI director, and remains during the Trump administration. Trump did not like Christopher Wray. Christopher Wray was also Republican, but he was a civil servant and career prosecutor first, and he did not hesitate to tell the truth, regardless of whether Trump or others liked it. And s- and what was interesting is that as early as April 2020, Trump had tried to remove Wray and replace him. But his Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr, who was a complete Trump loyalist and lackey until he spoke out at the very end on some of and said the election was secure and that Trump didn't win and what Trump was trying to do was illegal. Even Bill Barr threatened to resign if Trump replaced Christopher Wray. So Trump backed down at that point. Um, but Ray did remain in his term, or I should say, remained in as FBI director when Joe Biden took office. President Biden took office, and Ray was in charge during the insurrection, and was even questioned during that period by House Republicans, and he defended the FBI's actions in terms of going after defendants who were accused of misconduct on January 6th and include accused of violence. And so, and Ray has also been forthright on saying that he did believe the Trump campaign was targeted by the FBI unfairly. He also denied that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 presidential elections, which was another lie that Trump and his pro-Russian lackeys spread pretty consistently. And so, and he also was very adamant in saying that Russia posed an imminent threat to us in terms of not only election interference, but also interfering with democracy itself. And so Trump was extra critical of Ray because of this, and because Ray was adamant about the 2020 election being fair and free, and had pushed back against some of Trump's most egregious claims. So Ray was Trump's own de facto appointee after Trump fired uh, Comey and then McCabe. And Biden, he continued to be FBI director during Biden's term, as is the norm, because again, it's a 10-year term. But Trump had already preemptively announced he wanted Ray gone. And so Ray went ahead and resigned. But and so and now you have Kash Patel, who is Trump's nominee for the FBI director, who doesn't have any experience, who has threatened to go after all of Trump's enemies, who actually made an enemies list, has said it numerous times on a podcast. It was published in a book. He wants to put people in jail that have either criticized Trump directly, people in Congress that have gone after him, for example, on the January 6th Commission, people like Nancy Pelosi, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, um, former or Congressman Bernie Thompson of Mississippi. And so he has an enemies list. Also, he's just a complete wackadoodle in addition to being scary and autocratic. He wrote a children's book that depicted Trump as a king. It actually sells on Amazon. You can actually find it. And it's called The Plot Against the King, with Trump holding a scepter. Like you can't make this stuff up. And I mean, it's just like it's crazy when I think people, you know, legitimately lay out the critique against Trump, his autocratic tendencies, the fact that he sees himself as above the law, sees all these different vestiges of the state and these important state institutions as working directly for him rather than for the American people. Just like the military versus my military when it's the American military. But then you have people under him who show unwavering loyalty, like Kash Patel, who actually write children's books where they depict him as a king. I mean, it's just like the cognitive dissonance is just fairly unbelievable. But the FBI purges are an example of extreme action that I think imperil the safety and security of Americans and the reassurance that the rule of law will be fired. And it doesn't bode particularly well because so many um, state police agencies as well as local police rely on the FBI, especially in small towns and jurisdictions, to assist with high level crimes like murders, cross state drug trafficking operations, interstate crimes that include racketeering and money laundering, major white collar investigations that most jurisdictions don't have the manpower, resources, or expertise to have them. That's where the FBI comes in. And if you're going to purge the FBI of all of those career civil servants with all that experience, you're not going to be able to assist local police agencies and jurisdictions in prosecuting those larger crimes. So they're going to either go unprosecuted or the prosecutions are going to be inadequate and poor and result in um, uh, there will be a lack of convictions. So people will um, be let off when they should be found guilty. And beyond that, you're also creating a system where you are putting people that are very, very politically minded in these positions of power that are going to be focused on grievances, grudges, and using and wielding the power of the state to just do Trump's bidding and go after his enemies. And that also puts the American people in a very dangerous situation. And I should stop and back up. So it is against the norm. FBI directors served 10 years. So the fact that Ray was basically forced to resign so President Trump could appoint an ultra MAGA, fanatical, cultish loyalist in place is not normal um, under any scenario. Uh, and it's even being overlooked in the media because the way many mainstream media outlets have reported on this is they just nonchalantly report on it as if it's another cabinet appointment when it's not. Trump has every ability, and it's completely normal for him to fill out his cabinet: Secretary of Education, Attorney General, Secretary of Commerce, HHS Secretary, all of these people. Now he's appointing crazy batshit people to these posts that are unqualified. But it's his prerogative to appoint new people. That's what you do. New administration comes in, all those positions change out. Those are political appointees that do serve at the pleasure of the president, that are there to implement his agenda. Now, they should have expertise. They should be knowledgeable. They should be grounded. They should be rational people. Most of his appointments, many of them so far, are not. But he has every right, and it's his prerogative to appoint those. But the director of the FBI is entirely different. That is a 10-year position appointment. That is an appointment that has and traditionally has always had independence from the presidency. And the fact that he would, you pin that and just, and the fact that the media would treat that as just another appointment when no, it should be discussed in the context of an abnormal move that Trump is making, and his nominee for, and it should always be, I think, spoken of in the context when people are speaking of Kash Patel and his nomination, that Trump uncharacteristic, well, it's characteristic, so characteristically, but in a departure from history and departure from norms, Trump forced the resignation of his FBI director that he had appointed back in 2018 for a ultra loyalist, and that this is not a nomination that would typically be open and be voted on by the Senate at this time because this is not part of his um, actual cabinet. But The reason he is appointing this is because he forced out the current uh, director, who he had himself had already appointed, out of spite for wanting somebody who was going to uphold and parrot his inaccurate claims and lies. So it's a lot to expect of the media, and context is not in vogue these days, but that should be part of the narrative and should be provided whenever these discussions occur. So that is basically where we are right now. Uh, we have so that is so if you want to talk about autocratic or you want to talk about authoritarian threat to democracy, we had that 4 years ago with an attempted steal of an election and a attempt to hold on to power through an illegal coup. And then we're having whiplash because 4 years later, the person who instigated all that was reelected, and he's taken swift action to completely break that government and break that democracy that he started. And the purging of the ranks of FBI and DOJ are just a drop in the bucket, a big drop. One of the most, I think, damning and alarming signs of what Trump plans to do. But that anti-democratic um, bent you can see elsewhere, particularly in just the contempt and disregard he has for the legislative branch and its check on power over him. And the perfect example of that was this federal funding freeze that he attempted to issue by executive order. He loves executive orders. And once upon a time, Republicans were not fans of executive orders because they saw them as particularly unconstitutional or constitutionally dubious at best, and that an over reliance on them was antithetical to the Constitution, which placed that type of decision making power in the hands of the legislature. But oh, how times change. Times change, parties change their beliefs and positions 180 degrees. And now we have Trump trying to do a blanket federal funding freeze um, that impacts, basically takes away the power of the Congress as it relates to funding, power of the purse, because Congress has already funded all of these programs, especially everything that would be dispersed for this year because they fund in advance. And the president, in one fell swoop, has said, I don't care. This may be your power outlined in the Constitution, but I'm going to overrule that. Now that's going through the courts and being reworked, but it's been a disaster already in terms of the impact it's had on everything from NIH, drug and medical trials, cancer funding, to Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, the just the confusion and doubt that it has sown across the board. But it also just shows a complete contempt and disregard for Congress. And then the most obvious one was President Trump's executive order attempting to do away with birthright citizenship, which is actually spelled out in the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, and even reinforced again through an 1868 statute, a law that Congress passed, and then the president at the time signed in the aftermath of the Civil War. So you have binding congressional authority through statute, followed by an amendment to the Constitution. And with one executive order, Trump said, I don't care. I want to end birthright citizenship, and I'm going to do this through executive fiat and basically overturn the Constitution, which is what he attempted to do. And so this is only the beginning, I think. And you can have the discussion and debate about birthright citizenship and whether it's a good idea or not a good idea. That's a valid discussion, but that's not the point of this. If you want to have that discussion, you go through Congress and you go through the appropriate mechanisms. If you want to change the amendment to the Constitution, that can be done through a two-thirds majority vote in Congress or through two-thirds ratification of an amendment to overrule the 14th Amendment that would happen through two-thirds of the state legislatures throughout the country. The president himself does not have unilateral authority to overrule the Constitution or to overrule congressional law. And that's what we're seeing Trump do because he just doesn't care. So those, those are the major threats, I think, that happened over this past 10 days that really foreshadow what is to come and how Trump is going to operate over the next 4 years. He has no regard for Congress. He basically dares them to defy him, and they tower in fear every time. We'll see if they grow a spine at some point. It remains to be seen if they have the gumption to reject any of his um, very unqualified and very dangerous nominees, especially at this critical time when European allies and others throughout the world are on guard for what's going to happen. But he is clearly usurping their power at every turn, and he's indicating that he doesn't respect their funding authority. He thinks he should have light item veto power and basically veto power across the board to decide what is funded and what isn't, and and that amendments to the Constitution don't matter. This is coming from the guy who said on Truth Social in the aftermath of the 2020 election that the Constitution should be shredded, should be suspended. I'm sorry, that the Constitution should be suspended if it would help him regain power. So he has no regard for not only norms, but the Constitution itself. He has no regard for Congress. He sees them as a tool, a means to an end. And he has no regard for the civil servants who have served us well in capacities like the FBI, the DOJ. Ultimately, we'll see that attitude reflected in other agencies as well, like the CDC and HHS, uh, and I think probably across the board. Um, so it's going to be interesting to watch and very scary because he is going to attempt to hollow out the federal workforce as we now know it. Basically, enact what he tried to do at the end of his first term with Schedule F, replacing career civil servants with political appointees who don't have expertise and experience. And we'll see how far he gets this time. Uh, Once again, the courts are the only stopgap, and it we know that we have a Supreme Court right now that is very pliant towards Trump's ends. So it remains to be seen. But if I were to bet money, the two justices you want to watch closely are the Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who are the two of the six Republican appointed justices that seem to show flashes of independence and rational thought um, from time to time. And if anybody is going to be a hold on Trump, it'll be those two. And unfortunately, it won't be unanimous or near unanimous decisions. I think it is, we're if we're going to have victories, it's going to be in the realm of 5-4 decisions. So that was a lot. I'm already over an hour. There's so much more I want to discuss. I do want to get way deeply into the crisis with Denmark and the taking of Greenland, possible taking of Greenland, as well as Panama, as well as going region by region, in some cases country by country, the impacts to the relationship with the United States. Um, Within the next episode, so get more into kind of foreign policy matters. But because it's been so long since I've recorded, I just wanted to take an opportunity to explain why it's taken me so long to get back to this. My work on the campaign, which was unsuccessful, just trying to take some time off and gather myself. Glad to be back. Expect to hear from me every week, in some cases twice a week. And also, I do plan on having guests from time to time. In fact, I would rather more often than not have guests join me and provide commentary and bat about topics. And again, getting back to foreign policy focus in front. So thank you again for your time. Um, Stay well, stay strong, don't get discouraged. We all have to take time off. We all have to find that mental wherewithal to continue going. We all need a break from time to time. Do what you have to, but keep in the fight. At least stay informed as much as you're able to on a given day. Uh, Break away when needed, but please be aware, be informed, because an informed citizenry is the only way we're going to make it over the course of the term, and it's the only way we're going to be successful in fighting back against some of the most egregious policies and also the most egregious power grabs that are likely to occur. That's how democracy survives. It's everybody remaining dialed in, focused, uh, aware, and taking opportunity. And I think that's an idea for a future podcast as well. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, especially as we weigh into international impacts with the new administration. But I also, so I want to kind of highlight instances. I'll highlight instances where democracies evolve into autocracies, and so we can spot the warning signs because there's plenty of examples of that. They don't get enough attention. But I also want to focus on democracies that have gone the autocratic route, but also have returned, have at some point rejected autocracy and recovered their democracy. So recovery is important, and it's important to highlight and focus on those countries that did return and recover their democracies or recover from the threats on their democracies. Countries like Poland, who and within the election they had last year, turned the page on the um, Law and Justice Party in their attempts to um, have a stranglehold over Poland. And there are other instances like that as well, where countries took back um, citizens took back their countries, they took back their democracies. So I'll highlight those from time to time. Positive stories, instances of where government is working well, where you have members of Congress, elected representatives of either party, who are standing strong for good government, for responsive government, for against corruption, uh, those types of things. And Yeah, and I just one other note, um, people who may be incredulous at what we've seen over the last 10 days and think, this is, you know, chaotic, this is dysfunction. It's dysfunction by design. It's an example of chaos over competence. So just remember, dysfunction by design, chaos over competence. That is the intent. The intent is to overwhelm you, to flood your brain with just all of this happening at once to discourage you so that you can't pay attention, you can't stay focused. Because remember, that's the playbook of dictators around the globe. I need to revisit the term that Putin and the Kremlin coined for it because they actually coined a term for that because they use it in Russia. And it's caused the Russian citizens to have just an attitude of being resigned to their fate and very discouraged and disillusioned and cynical to the point where they just give up and throw up their hands and say, I don't know who to trust. I don't know what to believe because, there's so much gaslighting out there and there's and it's unclear, where truth is and what is truth because of the disinformation campaigns waged by the Russian government. To some degree, that happens in China, although information is even more tightly controlled in China. So that is the playbook. Overwhelm, do, multiple things at once take your focus off so you can't focus on the big things, and instead your mind gets wrapped up in inconsequential, ridiculous notions like renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Stupid, ridiculous, but in the end, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter like the purging of the DOJ matters, or the trying to force out federal workers with this ridiculous buyout, or Elon Musk and his cronies without congressional authorization going in and accessing personnel files, office of management budget of all these employees. Like this is all like very serious stuff, but it gets drowned out by all the other noise and the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico thing, and whatever other inane, idiotic thing that Trump says in the moment, or that someone in his administration says. So try what I'm going to do, and what I encourage you to do is to separate all that out. Like, try to focus on the things that matter, ignore all the noise, know that they're trying to overwhelm you, know that dysfunction isn't a side effect of what we're happening, it's dysfunction by design, because they want you to feel like, and they particularly want their voters to feel like the government is corrupt, the government is dysfunctional. So we're going to go in and break it. We're going to prove that it's dysfunctional by breaking it, which may seem counterintuitive, but then it just will embed that distrust within their voters, and that apathy within voters who maybe didn't turn out during the election, because that's how autocrats win. It's through a combination of dysfunction and apathy. And so, overwhelming you is part of the plan. Chaos over competence is part of the plan. Don't let it win out at the end. Thank you. Talk to you again soon.